They say a kingdom keeps its secrets in its castles, but the kingdom of Aldermere kept its greatest secret out in the open, written on a wall where anyone could read it. And on one cold spring morning, a poor girl selling flowers noticed that a single line on that wall had changed overnight. She didn't know it yet, but that small change would shake the throne itself and force a grieving prince to make a choice no crown could prepare him for. In the heart of Aldermere stood the old capital city of Aldenford, a place of gray stone streets, crooked chimneys, and a wide market square that never truly slept. From before sunrise, the square filled with the sounds of cartwheels on cobbles, bakers calling out the price of warm bread, and the low murmur of 100 quiet conversations. And in the very center of that square, taller than any market stall, stood a great flat wall of pale stone that the people simply called the Register. The Register was not a book locked away in some dusty room. It was a public thing meant for every eye. Upon its smooth face, the royal scribes carved and painted the names of the crown, the king, the queen, the heirs, and every soul who stood in the line of the throne. Beside each name they wrote a short line of honor, a title, a deed, a word to remind the people who these royals were and what they had given. In most kingdoms, such things were hidden behind palace doors. But long ago, an old king of Aldermere had made a promise. He had said that the crown belonged to the people as much as to the palace, and so the people had the right to read, with their own eyes, exactly who ruled them and why. That promise had held for 300 years. The Register stood open to rain, to sun, to the touch of curious children, and to the gaze of anyone who wished to look. Among those who looked, none looked more faithfully than a girl named Marin. Marin was 17, thin as a reed. With dark hair she kept tied back with a strip of blue cloth. Every morning before the square grew crowded, she carried a shallow basket of flowers from the river gardens where she worked, bright yellow primroses, sprigs of lavender, small white blossoms that smelled of honey. She sold them near the base of the Register, and while she waited for her first customer, she did what she had done since she was a small child. She read. Reading had not come easily to her. Her family were not lettered folk, but her grandmother, before she passed, had spent a whole winter teaching Marin her letters by candlelight, tracing them in the ash of the hearth. And her grandmother had taught her not for the sake of contracts or coin, but for one reason only. So that you can read her name, the old woman had said. So that you never forget the queen who once touched your face. The queen her grandmother spoke of was Queen Isolde. Every person in Aldenford knew the story of Queen Isolde, though she had died 2 winters past. She had come to the throne as a foreign bride, sent from a distant land to marry King Alaric when both of them were young. The court had expected a proud, cold woman who would keep to her rooms and her silks. Instead, Aldermere had received something it had never seen before. Isolde walked. She walked out of the palace gates and into the streets, often without her shoes, her feet bare against the cold stone, because she said she wanted to feel the same ground her people walked. They called her, with love, the Barefoot Queen. She went where no royal had gone, into the poorest lanes where the roofs leaked and the children coughed through the winter, into the fever houses where nobles feared to breathe the air. She sat with the dying and held their hands. She carried bread in her own arms. When a flood took the lower town, it was Isolde who waded into the water to pull an old man from his sinking home, ruining a gown worth more than the whole street. She never spoke of these things afterward. She simply did them, and then she went home, and the next day she did them again. Marin's own grandmother had been one of those the queen had touched. In a hard winter long ago, when Marin was only a baby wrapped in rags, a woman in a plain gray cloak had knelt in their doorway and pressed a warm loaf and a silver coin into the grandmother's hands. It was only when the woman rose and her hood slipped that they saw her face and understood who had come to their door. The queen had smiled, laid a hand gently against baby Marin's cheek, and gone on her way without a word. The grandmother swore she felt the warmth of that hand for the rest of her life. That was why Marin read. That was why, every single morning before she sold a single flower, she lifted her eyes to the Register and found the Queen's name where it was written, high upon the wall, and read the line of honor beside it. She had read it so many times that she could have spoken it in her sleep. There it stood, carved deep and painted in gold that the scribes refreshed each spring. Isolde, Queen of Aldermere, the barefoot queen. She walked among her people and was beloved of them all. Maren read it every morning the way another person might say a prayer. It was her small ritual, her way of keeping her grandmother close, and of keeping the queen close too. On rainy days she read it huddled under her shawl. On bright days she read it with the sun warming the stone. She had read it in grief when the news of Isolde's death had first swept the city, when the whole square had gone silent and grown men had wept openly among the cabbages and the fish. She had read it, and she had drawn comfort from it, because as long as the line stood there in gold, it felt as though a part of the good queen had not truly left them. And then came the morning it changed. It was an ordinary morning at first, cold and pale, the sky the color of old pewter. Maren came to the square earlier than usual, her breath fogging in the air, her basket heavy with primroses that had opened overnight. She set her basket down at the foot of the register, straightened her back, and lifted her eyes to find the queen's name, as she always did. At first she thought her tired eyes were playing tricks. She blinked and looked again. Then a cold feeling crept into her chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. The line had changed. Where before there had been 3 full lines of gold, the name, the title, and the words of love, now there were fewer words. The proud name of Queen of Aldermere remained, but the beloved title, the Barefoot Queen, was gone. And the tender line that had made Maren's throat tighten every morning of her life. She walked among her people and was beloved of them all. That line had been scraped away entirely. The stone beneath it was pale and raw, freshly cut, the old gold gone as though it had never been. In its place stood only a single, cold, formal line, the kind of line written for any stranger. Consort to His Majesty King Alaric, deceased. That was all. Consort, deceased, as though she had been nothing more than a signature on a marriage contract, as though the woman who had knelt barefoot in the snow to feed a stranger's child had never lived at all. Maren stood frozen, her flowers forgotten at her feet. She read it once, twice, a third time, hopping each time that she had somehow read it wrong, that the words would rearrange themselves into the ones she loved. They did not. The cruel new line stared back at her, sharp and final. She did not understand it. She could not understand it. Who would do such a thing? Who would climb up to the register in the dark of night and scrape away the memory of a good woman? And why? What had Queen Isolde done in death to deserve to be reduced to a title and a single word, deceased, as if she were a line in a ledger of the dead? A cart rattled past. A man laughed somewhere across the square. The ordinary morning went on all around her, and Maren felt as though she were the only person in the world who had seen what had happened. Her hands began to tremble, and it was not from the cold. She was not, in truth, the only one, but she was among the first. By the time the sun had climbed above the rooftops, others had begun to notice. An old soldier who had served in Isolde's day came to pay his respects, as he did on certain mornings, and stood staring up at the wall with his mouth slightly open. A schoolmistress who brought her pupils to the square each week to teach them their letters from the royal names stopped mid-sentence, her finger raised toward the wall, and could not finish what she had begun to say. A baker's wife, a fishmonger, a pair of washerwomen with their baskets on their hips. One by one they drifted toward the register, drawn by the small knot of people already gathered, and one by one they looked up and fell quiet. The square, which was never quiet, grew strangely still. "It's been changed," someone said at last in a low voice. As if speaking too loudly might make it more true. The Queen's line, "It's been changed." That can't be. Look for yourself. Who would do that? The Queen, our Isolde, it says only consort now, and deceased, as if she were no one. The murmur spread outward from the wall like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. It moved from the square into the side streets, from the flower sellers to the bread sellers, from the market into the taverns, and from the taverns into every home in Aldenford before the day was through. And everywhere it went, it carried the same two feelings, tangled together, a deep, aching hurt and a rising, restless question. Who had ordered this, and what did it mean? For the people of Aldermere understood something about the register that made the change far more than a matter of paint and stone. The register was not idle decoration. Every word upon it was placed there by the authority of the crown itself. Nothing was carved, and nothing was scraped away, without an order sealed by the highest power in the land. A scribe did not simply decide, on a whim, to erase a queen. Someone had commanded it, someone with the right to command such a thing. And in all the kingdom of Aldermere, the number of people who held that right could be counted on the fingers of a single hand. That was the thought that made the hurt curdle into unease, because it meant this was not an accident, nor the work of some drunken vandal in the night. It was a decision, a cold, deliberate decision made by someone at the very top of the world to strip the beloved queen of her honor and reduce her to a stranger. Maren, still standing at the foot of the wall with her untouched flowers, heard the whispers grow around her and felt something harden in her chest beside the grief. It was not like her to be bold. She was a quiet girl who kept her head down and sold her flowers and troubled no one. But as she looked up at that raw, scraped stone, she thought of her grandmother's voice in the firelight and the warmth of a hand against a baby's cheek, and she found that she could not simply pack up her basket and go home as though nothing had happened. "Someone should tell the prince," she said. She had not meant to say it aloud. The words simply came out of her, small and clear in the hush. But the old soldier standing beside her heard them, and he turned to look at her, and slowly he nodded. He said, "the Prince Cassian, he'd not stand for this. He loved his mother more than his own life. If the prince knew—" He stopped, and his weathered face darkened. "But the prince is not here, girl. He's away in the north. Has been for near a month, seeing to the mountain roads and the winter villages, same as his mother would have wanted. That's likely why it was done now while he's gone." A ripple of understanding passed through those near enough to hear. If the prince was away, then whoever had ordered the change had chosen their moment carefully. They had waited until the one person most likely to defend the queen's memory was 100 miles distant, out among the snowbound passes, with no idea what was being done in the capital behind his back. And that made the whole thing feel worse. It felt like a thing done in shadow on purpose, so that no one who cared could stop it. High above the square, beyond the market and the crooked streets, the royal palace of Aldermere looked down upon the city from its rise of gray rock. Its towers caught the pale light, its banners hung limp in the still air, and its great gates stayed shut. Within those walls, the people of the palace already knew what the people of the city were only now discovering. And within those walls, the mood was very different, not grief and anger, but a tense and careful silence. The silence of people who knew a storm was coming and did not know how to stop it. In a long room lined with shelves of parchment, an old man sat with his head bowed over a desk. His name was Aldous, and he was the keeper of the register, the man whose duty it was to oversee every word upon that wall, and whose scribes had carried out the change in the cold hours before dawn. Aldous had served 3 kings and 1 queen. He had known Isolde, had walked with her, had once wept at her funeral like everyone else. He was not a cruel man, and he had not wanted to do what he had done. But an order had come, a true order, sealed and lawful, from the one authority in all the land that Aldous could not refuse. He had read it 3 times, hoping he had misunderstood. He had not, and so, with a heavy heart and a heavier hand, he had sent his scribes up the ladders in the dark, and he had turned his face away rather than watch them scrape the gold from the good queen's name. Now he sat in his room of parchment, listening to the distant, rising sound of the city below, the sound of a wound being felt by 10,000 people at once, and he pressed his old hands over his eyes, and he wondered what he had done, and what would happen when the prince came home. For Aldous knew, as the old soldier in the square had known, exactly what kind of man Prince Cassian was. Cashen Aldermere was the only living child of King Alaric and Queen Isolde, the sole heir to the throne, and in the 2 winters since his mother's death he had become the great hope of the common people. He was 25 years old, tall and dark-haired like his mother, with her same quiet way of watching a room before he spoke. Where his father the king had grown distant and gray with grief, hidden away behind palace walls, Cashen had done the opposite. He had gone out. He had taken up his mother's work as though it were a torch handed to him, walking the same poor lanes she had walked, sitting with the same suffering people, carrying on the promise she had made with her bare feet on the cold ground. The people saw Isolde living on in her son, and they loved him for it with a fierce and grateful love. And it was that very work that had taken him away. A hard winter had struck the northern mountains, burying whole villages, closing the passes, cutting off the highland folk from bread and aid. It was exactly the kind of trouble his mother would have ridden toward, and so Cashen had ridden toward it, spending weeks among the snow and the frightened villagers, digging out roads, opening granaries, doing the slow, cold, thankless work that king's sons were not supposed to do. He had thought of nothing but the villages. He had no notion at all of what was happening to his mother's name upon a wall in the capital. That changed on the 15th day of his absence, in the late afternoon, when a rider came hard up the mountain road with a lathered horse, and a letter pressed inside his coat. Cashen was standing knee-deep in snow at the edge of a half-buried village when the rider found him, helping 2 farmers haul a beam clear of a collapsed roof. He was mud to the elbows, and there was frost in his dark hair, and he looked, in that moment, nothing at all like a prince. The rider had to ask twice before he was sure he had found the right man. The prince took the letter, broke the plain seal, and read it standing there in the failing light while the snow came down around him. Those who watched said afterward that they saw his face change as he read, that the color drained from it, and then came back all at once, hot and dark, and that his hand tightened on the paper until the edge of it tore. He read it once, and then he read it again slowly, as though he could not make himself believe the words the first time. The letter was short. It had been written by a friend at court, a man who loved him and had thought he ought to know. It told him, plainly and without softening, what had been done to his mother's name upon the register. The title stripped away, the words of love scraped from the stone, the cold new line put in their place. And it told him one thing more. One thing that the people down in the square did not yet know for certain, but which the writer of the letter knew because he had seen the sealed order with his own eyes. The order to erase Queen Isolde's honor had not come from some jealous noble, nor from a scheming enemy of her memory. It had come sealed and signed from King Alaric himself, from her own husband, from Cashen's own father. The prince stood very still for a long moment after he read that line. The snow settled on his shoulders. The farmers, sensing something, had gone quiet behind him. When at last he lowered the letter, his jaw was set and his dark eyes were bright with a feeling that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something made of both. He turned to the rider. "My horse," he said, "now." "My prince, the pass is at night." "My horse," Cashen said again, and there was something in his voice that ended the matter. Within the hour he was riding south, alone. Down out of the white mountains toward the gray city of Aldenford, faster than was wise and faster than was safe, the letter still crushed in his gloved fist. He rode through the dusk and into the dark, changing horses at the way stations, sleeping in the saddle when he slept at all, and the whole long way home he turned the same questions over and over in his mind. The same questions the people in the square were asking, only sharper, because for him they cut to the bone. Why would his father of all people do this? His father who had loved Isolde so deeply that her death had all but hollowed him out, who had not smiled in 2 winters, who could barely speak her name aloud. That grieving, broken man had ordered her memory scraped off a wall as though he wished to forget she had ever lived. It made no sense. It made no sense at all. And yet the seal on the order had been the king's own. There was no mistaking it. Somewhere beneath his anger, in a quieter and more frightening place, Cashin felt the first cold stirring of a suspicion he could not yet name. His father was not a cruel man. His father was not a forgetful man. If the king had done this terrible thing, then perhaps, there was a reason for it. A reason hidden beneath the cruelty. A reason no one had told him. And the not knowing of it frightened him more than the anger did. He rode into Aldenford 3 days later in the first gray light of morning on a horse near dead from the road. The city was already awake and already restless. As he passed through the outer gates, hollow-eyed and travel-worn, word of his coming ran ahead of him faster than his tired horse could carry him, and people began to spill out of the streets to see him, the good queen's son, come home at last. They did not cheer. They watched him in a heavy, hopeful silence, and their eyes turned from him to the great scraped wall in the square and back again, as if to say, "You have seen it too now. You will make this right. You must." Cashin slowed his horse as he came into the square. He looked up at the register, at the raw pale stone where his mother's honor had been, at the cold single line that had replaced her whole shining life. And the people watched the prince look at it, and they held their breath. At the foot of the wall, still at her usual place though she had sold no flowers in 3 days, a thin girl with dark hair and a strip of blue cloth stood watching him too. Marin did not know if the prince saw her, but she saw him, saw the grief and the fury and the fear all moving across his young face at once. And somehow, seeing that a prince could feel exactly what she felt, she was no longer quite so afraid. Cashin Aldermere sat his horse before the wall for a long moment, in front of the silent, waiting city. Then he lifted his eyes from the ruined stone toward the gray towers of the palace on the rise above, where his father the king sat behind shut gates and would not speak. And quietly to himself, in a voice that only his tired horse could hear, the prince said, "Then I will make you speak, father. Whatever the reason is, I will drag it into the light." He turned his horse toward the palace road, and he began to climb. The palace gates did not open for Prince Cashin at once, and that, more than anything, told him how much had changed while he was away. He had ridden through those gates 1,000 times in his life. They had always swung wide at the sight of him, the guards snapping to attention, the great iron hinges groaning their familiar welcome. But now, as his exhausted horse carried him up the last stretch of the palace road, he saw the gates standing shut, and he saw new men upon the walls, men in dark gray livery he did not recognize, watching his approach with flat, careful eyes. His own household guard, the men who had known him since boyhood, were nowhere in sight. Cashin reined in before the closed gate and looked up. "I am the Prince of Aldermere," he said, and though his voice was rough from 3 days of cold and dust, it carried. "Open." For a long moment nothing happened. The gray-liveried men glanced at one another. Then a smaller door set within the great gate creaked open, and a single figure stepped out to meet him, not a guard, but a lord, tall and lean, dressed in the same dark gray, with a chain of office glinting at his throat and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Cashin knew him. Everyone at court knew him. His name was Lord Vareth, and he was the Lord Chancellor of Aldermere, the highest of the king's ministers, the man who held the royal seals and managed the daily business of the crown. He was a clever man, soft-spoken and patient, who had risen high in the years since Queen Isolde's death, high enough, some whispered, that little now happened in the palace without his knowledge or his hand upon it. Cashin had never liked him, though he could never quite have said why. There was something about Vareth's smoothness, the way he agreed with everyone and committed to nothing, that had always made the prince's skin crawl. "Your Highness," said Vareth, bowing low, spreading his hands in a show of warmth. "What a joy to see you returned safe from the mountains. We had feared the passes might have claimed you. The whole court has been sick with worry." "Open the gates, Vareth," Cashin said. "I would see my father." The Chancellor's smile flickered, so briefly that a less watchful man would have missed it. Of course. Only His Majesty is unwell today, my prince. Gravely tired. His grief, you understand, weighs heavier on him with each passing month. He has given orders that he is not to be disturbed. I would not be doing my duty if I did not ask you to rest first, to bathe, to eat, and to see him tomorrow when he is stronger. I have not ridden 3 days without sleep to be told to wait until tomorrow. Cashin swung down from his horse and stood before the chancellor, and though he was gray with exhaustion, there was iron in him now. I saw the wall, Vareth. I saw what was done to my mother's name. I will hear from my father's own mouth why it was done, and I will hear it today. Something moved behind Lord Vareth's eyes, a quick, cold calculation. Ah, he said softly, the register. Yes, a painful business, my prince. A necessary correction, I'm afraid, but painful. A correction. Cashin's voice was dangerously quiet. You call the erasing of a beloved queen a correction. I call it the law, your highness. Vareth folded his hands. The register records what is true, and the true and lawful style of the late queen was consort to his majesty. The other words, the title the common folk gave her, the pretty line about walking among them, those were sentiment, poetry, not fact. Someone some years ago allowed such sentiment to be carved where only fact belongs. His Majesty in his wisdom has chosen to set the record straight. That is all. Every word of it was reasonable. Every word of it was smooth and calm and impossible to argue with directly. And every word of it, Cashin felt in his bones, was a lie wrapped around something rotten. His father had wept for 2 winters over Isolde. His father did not, in his grief, suddenly wake one morning and decide her love for the people was mere poetry unfit for stone. It made no sense, unless someone had put the idea in his head, unless someone had reasons of his own. Cashin looked at the chancellor for a long moment. Then he looked past him, at the gray men on the walls, and understood with a cold drop in his stomach that while he had been away in the snow, this soft-spoken man had quietly closed his fist around the palace. Let me pass, Chancellor, the prince said, or explain to the city why the crown's own heir was turned away at his father's door. That reached him. Vareth was clever enough to know the mood of the streets. He had surely heard, as Cashin had, the low, restless murmur rising from the square. He could not afford to make a public martyr of the beloved queen's son on the very morning of his return. The chancellor inclined his head, all warmth again. Naturally, my prince, forgive an old servant his caution. Enter and welcome home. The small door opened wider. Cashin handed his horse to a stable boy and walked into the palace of his childhood, and it felt, with every step, like walking into a house that had been quietly stolen from him. He went first to his father's apartments, and there he met the second wall. The doors to the king's chambers were guarded by 2 of the gray men, and they did not move aside. His Majesty rests, one of them said in the same flat tone as the others, and though Cashin argued and then commanded and then very nearly forced his way through, the men would not yield. They had their orders, they said, from the chancellor, in the king's name. And when Cashin pounded on the great doors with his own fist and called out to his father through the wood, "Father, it is Cashin, speak to me." No answer came from within, only silence, a thick, closed, terrible silence. He stood there with his forehead against the cold door, breathing hard, and for the first time since he had read the letter in the snow, the anger drained out of him and left only fear. Because there were only 2 explanations for that silence, and both of them frightened him. Either his father would not speak to him, had shut him out, chosen the chancellor's counsel over his own son's love, or his father could not speak to him, was being kept from him, held behind those doors by gray men who served another master. Cashin did not know which was worse. He only knew that the father he had left behind 2 months ago, grieving but whole, was gone from his reach, and something dark had grown up in his place. He did not sleep that day, though his body begged him to. Instead, once he had washed the road from himself and eaten a little, he went quietly, by the old servant's passages he had known as a boy, to the one place in the palace he thought might still hold the truth. He went to the long room of parchment to find the keeper of the register. Old Aldous was there, as Cashin had known he would be, bent over his desk among the shelves, an untouched cup of wine going cold at his elbow. When the prince stepped in and the old man looked up and saw who it was, his lined face crumpled like a child's. He rose so fast he knocked the cup over, and the red wine spread across the parchment like a stain of blood, and he did not even seem to notice. "My prince," Aldous whispered. "Oh, my prince, forgive me, forgive me." "You did it," Cashin said. "It was not a question. Your hand, your scribes." "My hand," the old man's voice broke. "My scribes, my ladders, my order given in the dark. I scraped away my own queen's honor with these two hands, and I have not slept an hour since, and I will not sleep again until I am in my grave." He sank back into his chair, trembling. "I loved her, my prince. You know I loved her. I wept at her tomb like a fool, and still I did it, because the order came and I am a servant, and a servant does as he is bid or he is broken." Cashin crossed the room and knelt before the old man's chair so that their eyes were level, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler, because he saw that Aldous was as much a victim in this as the queen herself. "Then help me now," he said. "Not with excuses, with truth. Who gave the order, Aldous? I have been told it came from my father. I have been told it bears his seal. But I do not believe my father woke one morning and chose to do this. Tell me what you know." The old keeper looked at him for a long, wavering moment, weighing something terrible in his mind, his fear of the Chancellor against his love for the prince and the dead queen both. And love won. It won because it always had in Aldous beneath all his weakness. With shaking hands he rose, went to a locked chest in the corner of the room and drew out a single folded document, sealed in dark wax. "This is the order," he said, holding it out. "Read it yourself, my prince. Read whose seal is upon it, and then read what is written upon it, and you will understand why I have not slept." Cashin took the document and unfolded it beneath the light of the old man's lamp. The seal was his father's. That much was true, and it struck him a blow to see it, the familiar crest of the House of Aldermere, pressed into the wax by the king's own signet ring. There was no forging that. But it was not the seal that made the breath catch in Cashin's throat. It was the words above it. For the order was written in the king's own hand. Cashin knew that hand as well as his own, and it was not the cold, careless command of a man setting a record straight. It was something else entirely. It was written in a shaking, uneven scrawl, the letters pressed so hard into the page in places that the pen had torn through. And beneath the formal command to alter the register, in a smaller, more broken line, as though the king had added it against all sense and all wisdom, in a moment when his heart had overruled his hand, were 7 words that made no sense at all. "Forgive me, Isolde, it is to save him." Cashin read the 7 words 3 times. To save him. To save whom? Him, the king himself. No, the king would not write of himself in such a way. Him meant another. Him meant a man the king loved enough to shame his own dead wife for, and there was only one such man in all the world. It is to save him. Him was Cashin. The prince knelt there in the parchment room with his father's torn and shaking order in his hands, and the whole shape of the thing turned over in his mind, and where before there had been only cruelty and mystery, now there was something far more terrible. Love. His father had not erased Isolde's honor out of coldness or forgetting. He had done it in grief and in terror, with a shaking hand, weeping onto the page, because somehow, in some way Cashin did not yet understand, tearing down the memory of the mother was the price of saving the son. "What does it mean, Aldous?" Cashin's voice was barely a whisper. "Save me from what? I am the heir. I am in no danger. What could threaten me so greatly that my father would shame my mother to shield me from it?" The old keeper's eyes filled with tears. "That, my prince, I do not know. I swear it on my soul. The order came to me sealed with only the command and those few words below, but I know this much." He leaned close and his voice dropped to the barest thread of sound as though the shelves themselves might be listening. "It came to me through the Chancellor's hand. Lord Vareth brought it to me himself in the dead of night, and when he gave it to me he was smiling. Whatever fear your father wrote of, whatever danger hangs over you, I would wager my life that the man who holds it over the king is the same soft-spoken lord who now guards your father's door and calls it grief. Varith. Of course it was Varith, the smooth-tongued chancellor who had risen so high in the years of the king's mourning, who had filled the palace with his own grey men while the king wept and the prince worked among the poor, who had met Cashen at the gate with lies dressed up as law. Whatever this danger was, whatever hidden blade hung over Cashen's head, it was Varith's hand upon the hilt. Cashen was as sure of it as he had ever been of anything. But knowing the hand was not the same as knowing the blade. He still did not understand what threat could be so great that it had brought a king to his knees, and he could not fight a thing he could not see. "I need to know what he holds over my father," Cashen said, rising to his feet, the torn order still gripped in his hand. "The threat itself, the weapon. Without it I am striking at shadows." "Then you must find it, my prince, before he learns you are looking, and you must be quick." Aldous gripped his sleeve. "There is something else, something I heard that I was not meant to hear. 3 nights passed before your return. The chancellor met in the lower hall with a man, a stranger, cloaked, come in secret through the river gate. I saw them only for a moment as I passed, but I heard Varith say to him, clear as a bell, 'When the prince returns, we move to the next step.' The wall was only to show the king we are in earnest. The next concession will not be so gentle." The old man's grip tightened. "Do you understand, my prince? The wall was only the beginning. Whatever Varith truly wants from your father, the erasing of the queen was merely his opening move, a small cruelty to prove he could force the king's hand. There is more coming, something larger, and it begins with your return." Cashen stood very still, the pieces turning coldly in his mind. Varith had not simply wanted to shame the queen. He had wanted to test the king, to prove to himself, and to his king, that his threat was real enough to make Alaric commit an act of public cruelty against the wife he had adored. The ruined wall was a demonstration, a first payment, and now, with the prince returned, the chancellor was ready to demand the true price, whatever it was. Which meant Cashen had very little time. He spent that night, and the next day moving through the palace like a ghost in his own home, using every hidden passage and forgotten stair he had learned as a boy, watching the gray men, learning their patterns, listening at doors. It was strange and bitter work, to skulk through the halls of his own inheritance as though he were a thief. But he learned things. He learned that the chancellor had taken over an entire wing of the palace for himself and his men, and that the doors to it were always guarded. He learned that no letter left or entered the king's chambers that did not first pass through Varith's hands. He learned that his father had not been seen outside his rooms in weeks, that even the servants who brought the king's meals left the trays at the door, and that no one at all, was permitted to speak with the king alone. And he learned one thing more, the thing that finally showed him a path forward. He learned that once each week, on the evening of the 7th day, the chancellor rode out from the palace after dark, alone but for 2 of his gray men, and did not return until the small hours of the morning. Where he went, no one could say. But Aldous' words came back to him. A stranger, cloaked, come in secret through the river gate, and Cashen felt certain that wherever Varith went on those nights, he went to meet the source of his power, the keeper of whatever weapon he held over the king. The next 7th evening was 2 days away. While Cashen moved through the palace above, down in the city below, another had not been idle. Marin, the flower seller, had not gone back to her flowers. She could not. Every morning she came to the square and stood at the foot of the ruined wall, and every morning the raw scraped stone stared back at her, and something in her would not let it rest. She had heard, as all the city had heard, that the prince had come home and gone up to the palace and had not come down again. And she had heard the darker whispers too, that new gray soldiers walked the palace walls, that the king had not been seen, that the smiling chancellor now spoke in the king's name for everything. Marin was only a poor girl with a basket of flowers, and she knew there was little she could do against lords and chancellors. But she knew the city as the lords did not. She knew its lanes and its gossip, its washerwomen and its stable hands, the vast quiet network of common folk who saw everything and were noticed by no one. And so she began, in her small way, to listen. She asked questions where a flower seller could ask them without drawing an eye, at the wells in the market, at the river gate where the boats came in. And it was at the river gate, from an old boatman who ferried folk across for a copper, that she heard something that made her heart go still. The boatman told her, grumbling over his pipe, of a strange fare he'd been carrying these past weeks. A cloaked man, foreign by his accent, who came down the river by night and asked to be put ashore not at the public dock, but at the old water stair beneath the palace's eastern wall, the forgotten one, the one that led up into the palace itself through a passage most folk had forgotten existed. The boatman didn't like it, he said. The man paid in gold, which was fine, but he had a cold way about him, and once when his cloak had fallen open, the boatman had glimpsed what the stranger carried close against his chest. Not a sword, not a purse, but a flat wooden case, banded in iron and locked with 3 locks, that the man guarded as though it held his own beating heart. A locked case, guarded above all things, carried in secret to the palace by night. Maren did not know what was in it, but she knew, with the same certainty that had kept her standing at that wall for a week, that whatever the smiling chancellor held over the king and the prince, whatever weapon had erased her beloved queen and now threatened worse, it was in that case. And she knew the one thing that might matter more than anything, that the cloaked man came by the river, by night, to the old water stair beneath the eastern wall. She had no way to reach the prince locked away in his palace. Lords did not take messages from flower girls. But as she stood there by the gray water in the fading light, turning the boatman's words over and over, Maren made up her mind that she would find a way to put what she knew into the prince's hands, whatever it cost her, because her grandmother had once been shown a great kindness by a barefoot queen, and Maren had decided that she would repay it, or die trying. High in the palace, as the same evening fell, Cassian stood at a narrow window and looked down at the darkening city, and at the great scraped wall in the square catching the last gray light, and he made himself a promise not so different from Maren's. 2 days until the chancellor rode out into the dark. 2 days until Cassian could follow him and find the root of it all. He did not yet know what he would find. He did not yet know what blade hung over him, or what price his weeping father had been made to pay, or how far the smiling chancellor's fist had truly closed around the crown. But he knew he would follow. He knew he would find it. And he knew that whatever it was, whatever it cost, he would not let his mother's name lie scraped and shamed upon that wall 1 hour longer than he had to. Behind him, in the guarded dark of his chambers, the king of Aldermere sat alone and did not speak. And below, in the sleeping city, a flower girl watched the river and waited for the night the cloaked man would come again. The 7th day was coming, and with it, everything hidden would begin, at last, to move toward the light. The 7th evening came gray and cold, with a river mist rising off the water and creeping up through the lower streets of Aldenford until the whole eastern quarter lay wrapped in a soft, blinding white. For Cassian, hidden in the shadow of a buttress high on the palace's eastern wall, the mist was a gift. He had waited there since dusk, cloaked in a servant's dark wool, his own crest hidden, watching the small, forgotten door at the top of the old water stair. Aldous had told him true. As the last light failed and the mist thickened, the door opened without a sound and Lord Vareth slipped out of it, wrapped against the cold, with no gray men at his back tonight. For this was business he trusted to no one. The chancellor did not ride out the front gate as he usually did to throw off watchers. Tonight he went down the slick, weed-grown water stair toward the river to meet the boat that Cassian, too, now knew would come. The prince followed him down through the mist, silent as the fog itself, his heart beating slow and hard. And he was not the only one moving through the white that night. At the bottom of the water stair, where the black river lapped against the old stone, a small ferry boat nosed in out of the mist, poled by a hunched old boatman. In it sat a single cloaked passenger, and clutched against that passenger's chest was a flat wooden case, banded in iron, locked with 3 locks. Cassian, crouched in the shadows of the stair, saw it and knew Aldous had been right about everything. Here was the stranger. Here was the case. Here, in this locked box of iron and wood, was the weapon that had brought a king to his knees. What neither the chancellor nor the prince knew was that a third figure had come down the river that night as well, for the old boatman pawing the ferry was the same one who ferried the cloaked man each week, and huddled unseen beneath a tarp of oilcloth in the bottom of his boat, having begged and bribed and pleaded her way aboard, was a thin girl with dark hair and a strip of blue cloth. Marin had guessed the night the stranger would come as surely as Cashin had. She had spent every copper she owned to be in that boat. She did not have a plan exactly. She only knew that whatever was in that case had shamed her queen, and that she meant to see it, and to find some way, any way, to bring what she saw into the light. The boat scraped against the stone. The cloaked stranger stepped out, and Lord Vareth came down the last of the stair to meet him, and there in the swirling mist, thinking themselves alone, the two men spoke, and both Cashin above them and Marin below them in the boat held their breath and listened. "You are late," Vareth said softly. "The mist," said the stranger in his cold foreign accent. "Better for us both. Is it done then, the wall?" "It is done. The whole city has seen it. The queen's honor scraped away by the king's own order and seal." Vareth's voice held a smile in it. He wept when he signed it, wept like a child, but he signed, which proves what we needed to prove, that he will do anything, betray anyone, even the memory of the wife he worshipped, rather than let the truth in that case see the light. "And the prince, he has returned."